Now, it's with very great pleasure that I want to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Edwin Rose. Edwin completed a PhD in History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge in 2020. And since then, he's been a Mumby Fellow at Cambridge University Library and is currently a Research Fellow at Darwin College, Cambridge. Edwin's research interests concentrate on the history of the life sciences, material culture, the history of the book, and collecting between the 17th and early 20th centuries. His projects have explored the Jamaican collections of Hans Sloane, about whom, of course, we heard last year, the development of working practices when gathering, producing, and communicating natural knowledge between about 1760 and 1820, and an exploration of the colonial legacies of the Cambridge Botanic Garden. A central theme in Edwin's research is the development, production, and distribution of natural history books that forms a key element of a book manuscript recently requested by the University of Chicago Press, and I understand that's due for submission in this coming March, this coming spring. So it's with very great pleasure, and with apologies for it being online again, Edwin, but thank you very much for being with us. And I can invite Edwin to speak to us on books, botany, and empire in 18th century Cambridge, 1760 to 1825. Edwin.
Sorry about that. I was muted. Yes, thank you very much for such a kind introduction, James, and the opportunity to share this research with the Bibliographical Society. The paper you're going to hear today really came about as the research I undertook as Mumby Fellow between 2020 and 2021 at Cambridge University Library. And it was initially going to be a project really on more internal institutional history. But what it's has turned into actually is a rather interesting, or I like to think it's an interesting account, I'll leave that to your judgment, of how the University of Cambridge actively integrated itself with the ever more sort of developing and globalized world of the 18th century. So to take it away, in July 1760, Dr. Richard Walker, the Vice Master of Trinity College in Cambridge, transferred £1,600 to the university for the purpose of establishing, to quote, a public botanic or physic garden. This purchased the old Augustinian Priory, a piece of land now known as the new museum site that was converted to form the first Cambridge Botanic Garden. Shortly after the foundation of the garden, Thomas Martyn was elected to the botanical professorship in 1763, a position he held until his death in 1825. This talk explores the approaches used during Martyn's long professorship by a succession of curators to collect, classify, catalogue, and cultivate plants from across the globe. This period has been ridiculed by historians and botanists alike. Writing in the 1830s, the botanist and horticulturalist John Lindley described Martyn as, to quote, the gentleman who filled the same chair for so many years without performing any other duty than that of collecting his pay, close quote. More recently, natural history in Cambridge during this period has been described as, to quote, being at the periphery of Cambridge intellectual life and leaving no lasting impression on the university, close quote. This was in spite of the formal integration of botany into the institutional framework after the Botanic Garden, Museum, and Library's foundation, one of the largest financial investments made by the university for scientific purposes in its history. Taking a chronological approach, this talk explores the development of the Cambridge Botanic Garden from its foundation in 1760 until 1825. Curators employed by the university during this time, who remained responsible for the practical and systematic management of the garden and museum, include Charles Miller, Thomas Martyn, John Salton, James Donne, and Arthur Biggs, who remained in post until 1845. An examination of the working practices and the networks established to facilitate botanical research and teaching after the foundation of this garden cast light on the new scientific projects of an 18th century university and how these intertwined with the expanding British Empire. In contrast to Kew Gardens, which emerged alongside the economic interests of the British state and other university botanic gardens intended to facilitate the activities of medical schools, the Cambridge Botanic Garden was designed to serve the natural theological agendas of professors and students with a view to show the utility of God's creation. This reflects many professors' use of natural theology as the framework through which they pursued their science, making subjects such as botany of interest to students who intended to be ordained into the Church of England. Thomas Martyn's clerical training encouraged him to shape the Botanic Garden, Museum and Library as repositories through which the full extent of God's creation could be explored, compiling a collection with the view to quote, present a natural history of the whole British Empire, close quote. To achieve this aim, Martyn and his curators developed a rigorously organized botanical library and a global network to gather species with a view to improve the university, emergent nation state, and wider empire on intellectual and financial levels. These practices were embedded in the Linnaean system of classification, which was just starting to take hold in Britain during the 1760s, standardizing names and descriptions to provide a concrete infrastructure that supported the exchange and incorporation of specimens into the university's botanical collection. In his lectures of 1764, Martyn stated that, to quote, the great enlargement of the British dominions in America has opened the field for new discoveries and improvements in natural history. And the extensiveness, I might also say the universality of our trade has put into our hands, gives into our hands natural treasures of every climate. This reflects Martyn's desire to explore the extent and utility of God's creation, integrating this interest into the Cambridge Botanic Garden's collecting strategy. During the 1760s, the main tasks of Martyn and Charles Miller, the first curator, was to design and plant and come up with a system for organizing information in the new garden. This was described by Martyn in the official minutes given on the 27th of October, 1768, to quote, whereas it appears to us absolutely necessary in order to facilitate the study of botany and to render the garden of general use, that the plants therein might be ranged and marked according to the system of Linnaeus, and that a catalogue of them might be printed. And this really bonded the collection of plants with a collection of books, with the actual active production of books for much of the garden's existence. Martyn and Miller's naming and division of the living plants into Linnaean classes, orders, genera, and species is reflected in their physical arrangement and outlined in a plan Martyn published in 1771. Plants were divided into groups according to the Linnaean hierarchy, although some species, which required warmer conditions, were kept in the south-facing greenhouses, and the larger trees and shrubs surrounded the Linnaean beds, following the outlines laid out by Linnaeus in Philosophia Botanica. And you can just see here on the slide an outline of where the garden used to be before it moved to its current site in 1845. This is the new museum site. The snapshot from Google Earth is in central Cambridge. And here is just the main outline of where things generally were in the old garden. The early Linnaean arrangements of the Cambridge Botanic Garden makes it the first institution of its kind to be founded according to the core principles of the Linnaean system in Britain. Although there were earlier botanic gardens, such as the Chelsea Physic Garden and those kept by Oxford and Edinburgh universities, these were arranged according to the relations of various plants to medicine or earlier systems of classification, such as that devised by Tournefort. A Linnaean design in Cambridge becomes evident from examining the general arrangements of the plants and buildings. For example, the greenhouses were placed alongside the back wall of the old mansion house, later Mortlock's and then Barclays Bank, and now the location of Zizi's Pizzeria. And you can see this through this view of the garden taken in 1815. The artist's back would have been towards Pembroke Street, and they are looking towards King's College Chapel. The curator's house, the former refectory of the old Augustinian priory, was located to the left in this particular image, on the site now occupied by the old Cavendish laboratory. And the small patch of surviving garden, if anyone ever walks down Free School Lane on this talk, there's a little sort of patch of scrubland. That was actually probably the front garden of this particular building. The old mansion house was a large and somewhat dilapidated medieval building at the north end of the site that was converted into a botanic lecture room and museum, where, to quote, "the large unfurnished room above the stairs be made a library for books in botany and other sciences relating thereto, and a part thereof for the hortus siccus," that being the herbarium or dry garden collection. Charles Miller, the son of the famous botanist Philip Miller of the Chelsea Physic Garden, was the first curator. Miller supported Martyn's scheme to design the garden alongside Linnaean principles. To manage information on plants, Miller kept an interleaved copy of the botanical sections of Linnaeus' Systema Naturae, the most recent Linnaean account at the time of the garden's foundation. However, rather than adding descriptions of new species, Miller's annotations revised specific taxonomic descriptions and the placement of different species within the classes and genera. These were based on his observations of the living plants in the Cambridge Botanic Garden. Miller's philosophical observations of the living plants were combined with their practical management. A book central to these practices was his copy of Philip Miller's Gardener's Dictionary that gave an outline and description for numerous horticultural practices to keeping different species in British gardens. However, to make this book useful when managing a Linnaean garden and correlate with his other annotated books, Miller added Linnaean binomial names to the margins, revising the name of every species mentioned in the printed text. These names, a few zoomed in versions you can see here, were extracted from the 1762-3 edition of Linnaeus' Species Plantarum and reflect the names used on the labels attached to the plants in the garden. Miller's annotations allowed him to cross-reference living species in the Cambridge Botanic Garden with descriptions and dried specimens in the Gardener's Dictionary, providing binomial reference points that linked the practical approaches to managing the garden with the philosophical system of Linnaeus. In his copy of the Gardener's Dictionary, Miller added several notes next to a species of triticum, now known as wheat. Matters concerning the yields and cultivation of wheat were of particular importance to Martyn, Miller, and those who attended the botanical lectures. Many were the children of landed gentry and prospective priests who had interests in agricultural improvement. In a letter to William Watson, published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, Miller outlined some experiments designed to increase the yields of wheat performed in the Cambridge Botanic Garden, with a view to, quote, "the probability of turning this experiment to use in agriculture," close quote, combining practical concerns with broader notions of improvement through education. In the 1760s and 1770s, the Cambridge Botanic Garden remained so impoverished it could not build up a library. Rather, it had to rely on donations from naturalists, including the physician John Wilmer, the founder Richard Walker, and various Cambridge colleges, and fellows of various Cambridge colleges, and Martyn's father, John Martyn, who presented his collection in 1763. John Martyn's collection was compiled from a library and a large collection of plant specimens. The various provenances of these shed light on Martyn's global networks extending across Britain, Europe, Asia, and the Americas. For example, in 1733, Martyn received a large consignment of specimens and books from the plantation physician William Houston, who had been employed by the trustees of the province of Georgia to collect specimens in the West Indies and Central America. Writing to the collector, physician, and plantation owner Hans Sloane, after being shipwrecked in Veracruz on the 5th of March, 1731, Houston described how, to quote, "I have sent up an Indian who has brought me down 4 small roots of it, which I hope will grow, and I believe we shall find it a plant quite different from the marvel of Peru," close quote. John Martyn's collection contains dozens of specimens from Vera Cruz, an example of which you can see on the slide here, and it seems probable they were collected by indigenous people Houston employed. It is currently one of my main research interests to explore the different aims and motivations of figures such as Martyn, Houston, and the indigenous person who collected the specimen for participating in this and similar schemes. By the 1760s, however, Thomas Martyn modelled his network on a similar structure to that of his father, actively seeking to establish the Cambridge Botanic Garden as a major institutional seat capable of receiving and cultivating species from across the globe. The first batches of seeds Martyn received came from the Americas via figures such as John Hope, Martyn's counterpart in the Edinburgh Botanic Garden. Writing to Martyn in 1765, Hope described how, to quote, "the gentlemen of the Society for Facilitating the Importation of Foreign Seeds, having just now received about 100 parcels of different seeds from Quebec, desired me to send for your garden at Cambridge a small part of each." Hope's redistribution reflects a sustained connection between Cambridge and Edinburgh and seeds from North America. And these really were put into or introduced to the garden because they were thought to have come from a temperate climate, and thus it's possible to actually cultivate them in Cambridge before the completion of the greenhouses. Hope's American seeds responded to Martyn's intention to quote, "turn for a study of nature to search for hidden treasures of different countries, especially those which have lately been added to the dominions of Britain in America." A direct response or reference to Quebec and Hudson's Bay, territories ceded to Britain in the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Charles Miller left Cambridge in 1770 to take up a position as an East India Company gardener at Fort Marlborough, Sumatra. In a letter he sent to the botanist Richard Poultenay, Martyn described Miller's departure and his role in Sumatra to quote, "Our garden has lost its curator in Mr. Charles Miller. He is gone to the East Indies to execute a favourite scheme of Mr. Sullivan's, the finding and cultivating of nutmegs, or any of the spices, or indeed any other vegetable productions which may make advantageous objects of commerce." And here is a picture of Fort Marlborough. Although he lamented Miller's departure, it did, however, give Martyn another correspondent in a different part of the world, connecting the natural theological outlooks of the Cambridge Botanic Gardens with the schemes of Lawrence Sullivan, a director of the East India Company. Miller sent several long letters describing specimens and seeds for Martyn to grow in Cambridge. These were collected during periods when Miller lived with the Batak people while travelling across northern Sumatra. Writing in response to a series of questions Martyn sent on the natural history of Sumatra, Miller described how, to quote, "I have made inquiry among the most learned of the Malays and also among those of the several different nations on this island," that being Sumatra, "concerning Mount Ophir and the almond trees." Miller consistently placed a heavy emphasis on the value of information supplied by indigenous informants, describing how, to quote, "I have taken 5 journeys into different parts of the interior country. I have hitherto been so fortunate as to meet with no obstructions from the country people, but on the contrary, have been well received and treated with hospitality everywhere." When attempting to collect cinnamon, indigenous groups refused to show Miller the process of curing the bark of the tree, retaining knowledge to maintain their agencies in a wider network of exchange. When the plants were of no great economic consequence, the Batak actively assisted with Miller's botanical collecting, when he formulated Linnaean names and recorded phonetic transcriptions of indigenous terms, as can be seen on some of the labels he attached to the specimens he sent to Martyn. This presented a direct line of communication between Cambridge and distant parts of the world, initiating a transfer of information between Martyn, Miller, and Batak societies in Sumatra. Martyn's network also extended through his connections with travellers who returned to Britain. In 1772, Martyn described, to quote, "Last week I had the pleasure of spending a morning with Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander. You will easily imagine how delighted I was to turn over the 3,000 specimens of plants, 1,000 of them new species, and coloured drawings of 700, all elegantly and accurately done upon the spot." This is a direct reference to Martyn's observation of the materials collected by Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander during James Cook's first voyage to the South Pacific, during which Cook charted large portions of New Zealand and New Holland, a continent we now know as Australia. Some duplicate specimens were added to the Cambridge collection, such as this particular example that Banks's party collected in Tierra del Fuego, now held by Cambridge University Herbarium. When in Sumatra, Miller, that being Charles Miller, who I mentioned earlier, maintained a regular correspondence with Martyn, who had taken over his role as curator in Cambridge. Miller requested books and, to quote, "the engraved head of Dr. Walker and a plan of the garden," close quote, illustrations appended to the first printed catalogue of the garden, Martyn's Catalogus Horti Botanicae Cambridgienses. A systematic list of every species in the garden, and Martyn had arranged the catalogus according to the Linnaean system, making it possible for attendees of his lectures to locate, identify, and compare different plants. Martyn noted that the catalogue was not produced for general circulation, commencing to quote, "It is intended wholly for the use of my pupils," close quote. The only other recipients were a few select friends. Aside from the plan and the portrait, Martyn's catalogus was compiled from a Linnaean list of binomial names and descriptions of species present in the Cambridge Botanic Garden. The limited circulation suggests it was produced as a private commission, financed by Martyn through subscriptions to the garden, donations, student fees. This mode of publication is representative of the private work undertaken by John Archdeacon, the printer for Cambridge University Press between 1766 and 1793, much of which consisted of pamphlets and books commissioned by members of the university. Martyn's catalogus represents a distinct form of genteel publishing that dominated late 18th century natural history, reserving knowledge on the Cambridge Botanic Garden for a select group of correspondents, students, and visitors. This work represents the first in a series of catalogues designed to inventory the Botanic Garden's collection, books that became more formally integrated with the university press after 1800. This book was followed by several improvements to the garden and museum that facilitated the addition of tropical plants. By 1775, Martyn was granted £100 to quote, "to alter and enlarge the stove, to repair the greenhouse, and to do several other necessary works," close quote. This allowed for the cultivation of a greater range of exotic species, and the museum was renovated to increase its capacity to hold specimens collected across the globe. To incorporate new species into the Linnaean information management system, Martyn had one copy of his catalogus interleaved with blank pages. These were annotated with new names and descriptions as material was received from across the globe, ensuring they were incorporated within the Linnaean systematic framework. The annotations in the interleaved catalogus relate to species sourced from a global network and cultivated in Cambridge after the completion of the greenhouses. To facilitate the management of these, Martyn developed a key that relates to the life cycle and locality of the plants that you can see on the slide here. Species described in the printed text have been present since Charles Miller was curator in the 1760s and were keyed to HP, indicating perennials or hardy biannuals. In comparison, many species described in Martyn's annotated descriptions had to be kept in the new greenhouse and stovehouse to ensure their survival. These include Protea conifera, that you can see on the slide here, a species endemic to the Western Cape, Canid lorca from North America, and Justicia hisifolia from the Canary Islands, species represented in Martyn's herbarium. Typical annotations appear on the printed pages and opposite sheets in the catalogus. that you can see here do also relate to a species called Ixia next to which you can just about see it. There's the words GHP, and this indicates that these species are perennial so long as they are kept in the greenhouse. Ixia crocata, a plant described just up here on the interleaved page, has a series of references following it, which refer to several important works for this system of managing information, including Linnaeus' Species Plantarum, Philip Miller's Figures of the Most Beautiful, Useful and Uncommon Plants, and William Ayton's Hortus Cuensis, which is the first catalogue of the Botanic Garden in Kew. Martyn's citation of Linnaeus and Miller's works are central for cross-referencing published names, descriptions, illustrations, specimens, and living examples of Ixia crocata held in the Botanic Garden and the museum. This created a network of references that gave mutual support to the description Martyn added to the interleaved page, cross-referencing the Linnaean description with an illustration commissioned by Miller, who first cultivated this species in the Chelsea Physic Garden after receiving seeds from the Cape of Good Hope. Miller commissioned this image of Ixia crocata from the German botanist and illustrator and engraver John Miller, formerly Muller, which depicts the flowers and the fruits in particular detail. This depiction of the sexual organs of the particular plants is essential for classifying them within the Linnaean framework. The published illustration and description were further supported by the dried specimen in Martyn's herbarium, and the living example kept in the greenhouses. These 4 reference points provided a mixture of composite images and specific examples used by Martyn to support the classification of this species. Descriptions, specimens, and archetypal illustrations were essential, really, for examining the plant when it was not in flower, an event which, according to Martyn's annotation, only took place between May and June each year. This was after the main university terms had finished, when very few students were actually present in Cambridge and actually had the ability to examine the flowering plant. The reference to Ayton's Hortus Cuensis reflects the integration of practices used to gather specimens from across the globe for the Cambridge Botanic Garden with those of Kew Gardens from the early 1770s. Cambridge became a beneficiary of the numerous seeds, bulbs, and plants sent out from Kew, objects repurposed to integrate botany with natural theology. The codes added to the interleaved catalogus reflect those used in Ayton's work. Although emulating the approach used to catalogue, classify, and locate species at Kew, numerous plants could be exchanged between the 2 institutions while cultivating relationships with figures such as Lord Bute, Joseph Banks, and Ayton. By 1784, the Cambridge Botanical Museum had grown to such an extent that the original building was no longer sufficient to house the collection, and the university syndics agreed to erect a new lecture room and museum you can see on the slide here. This was designed to provide a space for formal lectures as student numbers increased and house Martyn's Botanical Museum and Library. Writing to Richard Pulteney in 1783, Martyn described how, to quote, "I have been obliged to catalogue, arrange and pack up all my museum on account of the university pulling down my house," close quote. Shortly after this event, the old mansion house, which had previously contained the botanical lecture room and museum, was leased to the banker John Mortlock for £150, a sale that solved many of the Botanic Garden's financial problems. Martyn had been replaced as curator, although not professor, by John Salton in 1778, who continued to use the interleaved catalogus for the management of the garden. Salton's hand appears alongside Martyn's, and he seems to have kept using Martyn's systematic approach to codes, marking various species, for example, that originated in places like Peru with terms such as HA for hardy annual. In his description of Morus papiferia that you can see on the slide here, Salton added that it was its common name was the paper mulberry, and that it originated from Japan and the South Seas Isles. This species became particularly important to travelers in the Pacific. The bark was commonly beaten to produce bark cloth or tapper. The first examples were brought back to Britain by Joseph Banks and Johann Reinhold Forster, following James Cook's first and second voyages. And here is an example of the beaten bark cloth from the Cook collection, now held by the Cambridge Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. In comparison to other species, Salton added the abbreviation HS to the notes on Morus papiferia. This stood for Hortus siccus, roughly translated to the dry garden or herbarium of preserved specimens, symbolizing its accession into the Botanical Museum. Martyn and Salton gave tours of this collection, a necessity by the 1780s owing to increased class sizes. Writing to John Strange, the British envoy in Venice, Martyn described how botany, to quote, gains ground at Cambridge, and it will be hard indeed if out of 30 or thereabouts whose curiosity is annually excited, 1 or 2 may not be found to follow it up. To close quote. Martyn's tours are evidenced by a university notice he issued in 1781, in which he stated that, to quote, Mr. Martyn usually spends the morning in the museum and will be ready to give any previous information to those who design to attend his lectures, as well as to exhibit the specimens of natural history which he has collected in Switzerland and Italy, to both his pupils and to such as have the leisure to go through his course. These specimens were collected on one of Martyn's grand tours across Europe between 1778 and 1781, traveling with his family and as student. Many specimens came from fellow botanists and various botanic gardens. Others, such as that shown on the slide here, which were collected on various excursions that Martyn took. In this case, the Swiss Valley Glacier of Grindelwald. And he actually is quite specific. He gathered this particular specimen on the 3rd of August, 1779. And these these specimens, which he collected all through Europe, right the way down as far south as Naples, really started to build the university's collection. We've heard a lot about the British Empire, but it actually created links with other European empires, meaning it was very much international collaborative approach to gathering these materials. These new species were listed in a new catalogue of the Botanic Garden by John Salton, the Horti Botanicae Cambridgiensis Catalogus, published in 1794. Unlike Martyn's catalogus, Salton's merely lists the names, i.e. the Linnaean binomials, for each species represented in the garden, omitting systematic descriptions, notes concerning the biogeographical distribution, and common names. However, species that entered the collection after the production of the earlier catalogue, such as Protea and Morus, have been included, representing the global reach of the garden's collection. Salton was replaced in 1794 by the well-known gardener James Donne. Donne had trained with William Ayson at Kew, and in 1796, the trustees agreed to print a new catalogue with Cambridge University Press. This was the first edition of Donne's Hortus Cambridgiensis, a checklist of the contents of the Botanic Garden, a book that met several editions in his lifetime. This sat somewhere between Martyn's catalogus and Salton's Horti Botanicae in relation to its content on the geographical distribution of different plants. Although Donne omitted descriptions, he did include information on preferred climatic conditions for different species, geographical provenance, their annual life cycles, medicinal applications, seasonality, and whether they were shrubs or trees. And here's just a couple of specimens that Donne actually added to the collection. And you can see on here, many of them are actually referenced. Number 38, that actually relates to genus 30, or not genus, species 38 within a genus. It's not all entirely clear in Donne's own catalogue. By the late 1790s, Kew became a main source of exotic species for the Cambridge Botanic Garden, with Donne acknowledging, to quote, His Majesty's Botanic Garden at Kew for supplying many rare and curious species, close quote, from across the British Empire. By 1807, Donne was paying the wages of 10 gardeners responsible for maintaining an ever more diverse collection. By 1804, the guidebooks of Cambridge outlined a few choice species. Adjoining the garden is a hothouse, furnished with stoves for preserving exotics of the most improved construction. Among the exotics are a variety of singular trees and plants from New Holland, that being Australia, some tea, coffee and breadfruit trees, a cotton tree, and many others of equal curiosity and value. The whole garden is arranged according to the system of Linnaeus, close quote. Martyn gave his last course of lectures in 1796 before retiring to his Purton Hall vicarage in Northamptonshire, where he continued editing various botanical works. Darn continued to expand the garden, issuing editions of Hortus Cambridgiensis until his death in 1813. Despite his absence, Martyn's network ensured the continual influx of species into the Cambridge Botanic Garden. By 1815, Arthur Biggs, Don's successor as the curator, recorded the expenses associated with the carriage of seeds from botanic gardens in Paris, Vienna, Göttingen, Moscow, and Königsberg. This reflects the Cambridge Garden's participation in a pan-European network, forging bonds with other universities while redistributing species collected on other European imperial voyages. Seeds and specimens were often accompanied by catalogues of European botanic gardens, and typical examples include some of the very unusual catalogues in the collection now held by Cambridge University Libraries, such as some of the earliest catalogues of the St. Petersburg Botanic Garden, for example. These books really, nearly all classify their respective gardens according to the Linnaean system and were very useful for translating and transferring large amounts of information. By 1815, Biggs was recording postage charges for plants collected from across the British Empire, including a parcel of seeds he received from the Calcutta Botanic Garden. Many specimens cultivated in Calcutta required assistance from local Indians, and the relationship with Cambridge was facilitated by its strong links with Kew and simultaneous use of the Linnaean system to communicate information. Other seeds and specimens came from across Martyn's personal network. By 1821, Martyn explained to James Edward Smith, the president of the Linnaean Society of London, that, to quote, "Some time since I let the curator at Cambridge a parcel of seeds which I had received with a box of specimens from Van Diemen's Land. Some of them grew with me under many disadvantages," close quote. Martyn forwarded the specimens to Smith, describing how, to quote, "Of many species there is such an abundance of specimens that you may oblige all your friends. I offered the seeds to Sir Joseph Banks, but he seemed to think they already had them at Kew and regarded the garden at Cambridge, as the most proper place for them," close quote. These specimens were probably sent by Charles Fraser, the first state botanist of New South Wales, who visited Van Diemen's Land in 1818 under the direction of Governor Lachlan Macquarie. To sustain these connections in his absence, Martyn ensured that Cambridge maintained its relationship with Kew. Specimen exchange with Kew allowed Cambridge to grow its collection, becoming a repository that connected species from across the expanding British Empire to the broader natural theological interests of the university. In addition to receiving specimens from Kew, many were collected by the Cambridge academics and students who embarked on global travels. Edward Daniel Clark, Professor of Mineralogy and University Librarian between 1817 and 1822, undertook extensive travels through Europe, the Levant, and North Africa. By 1821, the Cambridge guidebooks described how the Botanic Garden, to quote, "contained many rare plants collected by Dr. E.D. Clark on his travels into Greece and Egypt, etc." This shows how Martyn's continued correspondence facilitated the collection and cultivation of species from across Europe and the expanding British Empire, building an imperial collection that integrated the travels and informal research projects of students and professors with the improvement of university scholarship. Martyn died in 1825 and was succeeded by John Stevens Henslow. A couple of years later, Henslow sent a pamphlet to all noteworthy botanists describing the poor state of the collection, commenting, to quote, "Not half of the specimens were in a sufficiently perfect state to be worth retaining, and that the library was outdated and now seldom consulted," close quote. Following a similar agenda to figures such as John Lindley, Henslow was determined to reform the Cambridge Botanic Garden, reorganise it according to the new so-called natural systems of classification, and portray botany as a modern science to be incorporated into the emergent teaching and natural sciences in Cambridge. This culminated in the removal of the garden to its current site in 1846. Henslow attempted to portray the old garden as old-fashioned and underdeveloped. Rather, as I have hoped to show in this paper, 1760 marked the point when botanical practice was connected to the institutional framework of the university in Cambridge, intertwining the systematic study of the natural world with natural theological interests and British imperial agendas. Unlike earlier and contemporary botanic gardens, the Cambridge Botanic Garden was not designed to train physicians or experiment on the commercial viability of certain species, but to instruct prospective priests in the extent and utility of God's creation. This was integrated with a diverse global network that fed on the massive networks they established. And it really reveals the numerous contributions and flows of specimens and information that built botany as a major discipline within university research and teaching. And that's everything I have to say. Thank you very much.
Edwin, thank you so much. It was really absolutely fascinating. Botany, I suppose, functioning through books, bonded by books, and all in the service not just of science and of careers, but also of empire and, as you said at the end, of the Almighty. Really, really enthralling. Thank you. Now, questions and comments, and we can